It's Friday, December the 6th. From The Economist in London, this is The Week Ahead, a look at some of the stories that will be in the headlines next week. I'm Tom Standage, the digital editor.
And I'm Tom Wainwright, the homepage editor. In The Week Ahead, trade talks conclude in Asia, the wheels turn on the Iranian nuclear deal, Venezuela's president faces a test, and a portrait of Jane Austen is auctioned.
Tom, let's start with the trade talks in Singapore, and these relate to the Trans-Pacific Partnership. These talks have been going on for quite a while, and the plan was that they were supposed to wrap up by the end of this year. So why does all this matter?
Well, it matters this weekend because it looks as though this meeting is going to be the last chance to wrap up the talks before the end of the year, which has always been the plan. Now, as you say, these talks have been going on for years, and that reflects quite how complex and important the agreement that they're trying to negotiate is. It's what trade people call a high-level agreement. In other words, it's not just a lowering of tariffs, although that would be important. It also covers more important or more complex things like regulatory reform, which would make trade between countries much easier. Now, the complexity of this means that getting an agreement between the 12 countries involved, the most important of which are America and Japan, has taken a long time, and this weekend people are hoping to get things wrapped up. It's looking difficult though because there are sticking points on both sides of the Pacific. In Japan, the agreement is backed very strongly by Shinzo Abe, who's backing it as part of his economic reform program, the so-called Abenomics, which we read so much about. So he's all in favour. But many people in the opposition are not so keen. Agricultural tariffs are the big sticking point there, and people in Japan are talking about preserving various what they call sacred farm products, including rice, poultry, meat, dairy, that kind of thing. So he's going to have difficulty there. Now, on the other side of the Pacific, Barack Obama faces a similar situation in some ways, in the sense that he's all in favour, but in Congress he faces real problems, both on left and on right. People on the left in Congress are worried that the TPP could cost jobs in America, and people on the right are opposed to it because they oppose anything with Obama's name on it. So he's had trouble being granted the necessary authority that he needs from Congress. So it's going to be difficult. People are still optimistic about the overall chances of these talks being signed off. But really the message for next week is that although the negotiations are taking place in Singapore, the politics that really matter are those being played out in Tokyo and in Washington, DC. So Tom, the wheels are turning on the Iran deal. What's happening next week?
So the context here is that Iran did a deal on November the 24th with the so-called P5+1, the 5 permanent members of the Security Council plus Germany. And Iran agreed to freeze its uranium enrichment facilities. It also agreed to allow more inspections, and it said that it would not go ahead with commissioning its new reactor at Arak. And so the two things that are happening next week are that inspectors from the IAEA, which is the United Nations nuclear watchdog, are going to go to Arak. They're not actually going to go to the reactor. They're going to the heavy water plant there, which they haven't been granted access to for more than 2 years. So this is very much a sign of Iran's new openness. It actually did a separate deal with the IAEA earlier in November, which this is part of, and it's also agreed to give them access to a uranium mine. So this is sort of a very important thing because it's showing that Iran is being more open. And the second thing that's happening is that there's another round of talks in Vienna, and that's between the P5+1 and Iran and the IAEA again, and that's about the implementation of this November the 24th deal. And so that's going to be focusing on the actual nitty-gritty of more inspections of exactly how you relax the sanctions, which is what Iran gets out of this. It gets some relaxation of the economic sanctions that are causing it a lot of pain. So the question is, how smoothly will all of this go? And assuming that it all goes without a hitch, then that will bode well for the implementation of this interim agreement and potentially for a more wide-ranging agreement after that, because it's only a 6-month deal. But if anything goes wrong, then that will be rather worrying for the overall prospects for a long-term nuclear settlement with Iran. Let's turn now to Venezuela, where there are local elections. Now, why do local elections matter? What do they tell us?
Well, they might tell us more than we might expect. They're being billed as a real referendum on the government of Nicolás Maduro, who was elected in April following the death of Hugo Chavez in March. Now, they come at a difficult time in Venezuela. His presidency has not been a big success so far, to say the least. The economy is probably the biggest flashing red light on most people's dashboards there. Inflation is running at more than 50%, one of the highest rates in the world. And partly because of that, we see shortages in supermarkets. If you go to a supermarket in Caracas, good luck finding things like milk, rice, even toilet paper. It's been very, very difficult. Now, Nicolas Maduro has responded to this by declaring or fighting what he calls an economic war against the private sector, which he blames for these economic problems. A few weeks ago, he declared that the prices of electrical appliances would be slashed, and just a few days ago, he said he'd do the same thing with cars. So the economy's in a bit of a mess, and the political situation is worrying too. A couple of weeks ago, he persuaded Congress to grant him the power to rule by decree, which he's been doing with great enthusiasm, in his words, fighting corruption, which seems to consist mainly of getting rid of his various enemies. So it looks quite bad for the president, and you might expect that this will be a chance for the opposition to do rather well. But it's a bit more complex than that. For one thing, the economic war that he's been fighting in some ways has been going down quite well with some people, because a lot of people have managed to walk away with a very cheap new fridge or a new car, and people rather like that kind of thing just before elections. The political centralisation that he's been carrying out has also given him a lot of power over things like the media, and so the opposition have found it very difficult to get on television and on the radio, and if they're not careful, they may find that this election is stolen from them at the ballot box. So it's a very, very difficult one to call in terms of predicting the results, but what it does seem is that Nicolas Maduro and his party will do everything they can to win this election by hook or by crook. Now, Tom, a portrait of Jane Austen is being auctioned next week in London. Why all the fuss?
Yes, you'd be surprised how much fuss a very, very small watercolour, 5 by 4 inches, of a 19th century novelist can cause. But it turns out to have been quite controversial. So Jane Austen was sketched by her sister Cassandra many years ago, and when her nephew decided that he was going to write a biography of her in the 1860s, he found that there wasn't a picture of her that he was happy with. He'd known her as a child. She died in 1817, so she wasn't around anymore. So what he did was he asked a local artist to take this sketch that her sister had done and do a new version of it that he felt was more representative, and it turned out to be much more flattering as well. And it's that painting that's going up for sale. The original sketch is in the National Portrait Gallery in London and has been for many years. So it's the painting which has been in the Austen family ever since that's going up for auction. But what's controversial about it is it's that painting rather than the original sketch that's been used as the basis of the image of Jane Austen, which is going to go on the new £10 note. And this is going to appear in 2017. At the moment, the £10 note has Charles Darwin on it, but a campaign was mounted pointing out that there weren't any women on any of the banknotes except for the Queen, and that this wasn't really on, and Jane Austen was duly chosen to go on the £10 note. Some of the campaigners subsequently received death threats on Twitter, and then an Oxford academic said that she thought that the image of Austen that was being used on the banknote had been sort of airbrushed. She'd had this makeover because it's been further cleaned up from the watercolour painting of 1870, and so she felt that this sort of made Jane Austen look rather sort of cuddlier and less intelligent than she really was. So this is the sort of backstory of the image, and the painting is expected to fetch between £150,000 and £200,000. But anyone who's disappointed, anyone who bids and fails to get it, and indeed everyone else in the country, will have the consolation that we'll all get our own copy of this image of Jane Austen on our £10 notes starting in a few years' time.
Well, that's our sketch of what's coming up. Join us next week for another discussion of events in the week ahead. In London, this is The Economist.